Let me quote you an instance. Well, 2 years ago, a Miss Vanlow, a very ladylike girl, came from home to keep house for her brother, Fred, who had an engineering shop for small repairs by the waterside. Suddenly, Falk takes to going up to their bungalow after dinner and sitting for hours on the veranda, saying nothing. The poor girl couldn't tell for the life of her what to do with such a man. So she would keep on playing the piano and singing to him evening after evening till she was ready to drop. And it wasn't as if she had been a strong young woman either. She was 30, and the climate had been playing the deuce with her. Then, don't you see, Fred had to sit up with them for propriety, and during whole weeks on end never got a chance to get to bed before midnight. That was not pleasant for a tired man, was it? And besides, Fred had worries then because his shop didn't pay, and he was dropping money fast. He just longed to get away from here and try his luck somewhere else. But for the sake of his sister, he hung on till he ran himself into debt over his ears. I can tell you, I myself could show a handful of his chits for meals and drinks in my drawer. I could never find out, though, where Fred found all the money at last. Can't be, but he must have got something out of that brother of his, a coal merchant in Port Said. Anyhow, he paid everybody before he left, but the girl nearly broke her heart. Disappointment, of course, and at her age, don't you know. Mrs. Schomberg here was very friendly with her, and she could tell you. Awful despair. Fainting fits. It was a scandal, a notorious scandal. To that extent that old Mr. Zegers, not your present charterer, but Mr. Zegers the father, the old gentleman who retired from business on a fortune and got buried at sea going home, he had to interview Falk in his private office. He was a man who could speak like a Dutch uncle. And besides, Messrs. Zegers had been helping Falk with a good bit of money from the start. In fact, you may say they made him as far as that goes. It so happened that just at the time he turned up here, their firm was chartering a lot of sailing ships every year, and it suited their business that there should be good towing facilities on the river, see? Well, there's always an ear at the keyhole, isn't there? In fact, he lowered his tone confidentially, in this case it was a good friend of mine, a man you can see here any evening, only they conversed rather low. Anyhow, my friend's certain that Falk was trying to make all sorts of excuses, and old Mr. Zegers was coughing a lot, and yet Falk wanted all the time to be married, too. Why? It's notorious. The man has been longing for years to make a home for himself. Only he can't face the expense. When it comes to putting his hand in his pocket, it chokes him off. That's the truth and no other. I've always said so, and everybody agrees with me by this time. What do you think of that, eh? He appealed confidently to my indignation, but having a mind to annoy him, I remarked that it seemed to me very pitiful, if true. He bounced in his chair as if I had run a pin into him. I don't know what he might have said, only at that moment we heard through the half-open door of the billiard-room the footsteps of 2 men entering from the veranda, a murmur of 2 voices. At the sharp tapping of a coin on a table, Mrs. Schomberg half rose irresolutely. "Sit still," he hissed at her. And then, in an hospitable, jovial tone, contrasting amazingly with the angry glance that had made his wife sink in her chair, he cried very loud, "Tiffin still going on in here, gentlemen?" There was no answer, but the voices dropped suddenly. The head Chinaman went out. We heard the clink of ice in the glasses, pouring sounds. The shuffling feet, the scraping of chairs. Schomberg, after wondering in a low mutter who the devil could be there at this time of day, got up, napkin in hand, to peep through the doorway cautiously. He retreated rapidly on tiptoe, and, whispering behind the hand, informed me that it was Falk. Falk himself who was in there, and what's more, he had Captain Hermann with him. The return of the tug from the outer roads was unexpected, but possible, for Falk had taken away the Diana at 5:30, and it was now 2:00. Schomberg wished me to observe that neither of these men would spend $1 on a tiffin, which they must have wanted, but by the time I was ready to leave the dining-room, Falk had gone. I heard the last of his big boots on the planks of the veranda. Hermann was sitting quite alone in the large wooden room with the 2 lifeless billiard tables shrouded in striped covers, mopping his face diligently. He wore his best go-ashore clothes, a stiff collar, black coat, large white waistcoat, grey trousers, a white cotton sunshade with a cane handle reposed between his legs. His side whiskers were neatly brushed, his chin had been freshly shaved, and he only distantly resembled the disheveled and terrified man in a snuffy nightshirt and ignoble old trousers I had seen in the morning hanging onto the wheel of the Diana. He gave a start at my entrance and addressed me at once in some confusion, but with genuine eagerness. He was anxious to make it clear he had nothing to do with what he called the tampisness of the morning. It was most inconvenient. He had reckoned upon another day up in town to settle his bills and sign certain papers. There were also some few stores to come, and sundry pieces of my ironwork, as he called it quaintly, landed for repairs, had been left behind. Now he would have to hire a native boat to take all this out to the ship. It would cost $5 or $6, perhaps. He had had no warning from Falk. Nothing. He hit the table with his dumpy fist. Der verfluchte Kerl came in the morning like a tam-ropper, making a great noise, and took him away. His mate was not prepared. His ship was moored fast. He protested it was shameful to come upon a man in that way. Shameful. Yet such was the power Falk had on the river that when I suggested in a chilling tone that he might have simply refused to have his ship moved, Hermann was quite startled at the idea. I never realized so well before that this is an age of steam. The exclusive possession of a marine boiler had given Falk the whip hand of us all. Hermann, recovering, put it to me appealingly that I knew very well how unsafe it was to contradict that fellow. At this I only smiled distantly. "Der Kerl!" he cried. He was sorry he had not refused. He was indeed. The damage! The damage! What for all that damage? There was no occasion for damage. Did I know how much damage he had done? It gave me a certain satisfaction to tell him that I had heard his old wagon of a ship crack fore and aft as she went by. "You passed close enough to me," I added significantly. He threw both his hands up to heaven at the recollection. One of them grasped by the middle the white parasol, and he resembled curiously a caricature of a shopkeeping citizen in one of his own German comic papers. "Ah, that was dangerous," he cried. I was amused, but directly he added with an appearance of simplicity, "The side of your iron ship would have been crushed in like this matchbox." "Would it?" I growled, much less amused now. But by the time I had decided that this remark was not meant for a dig at me, he had worked himself into a high state of resentfulness against Falk. The inconvenience, the damage, the expense, Gottverdammt. Devil take the fellow. Behind the bar, Schomberg, with a cigar in his teeth, pretended to be writing with a pencil on a large sheet of paper, and as Hermann's excitement increased, it made me comfortingly aware of my own calmness and superiority. But it occurred to me, while I listened to his revilings, that, after all, the good man had come up in the tug. There, perhaps, since he must come to town, he had no option. But evidently he had had a drink with Falk, either accepted or offered. How was that? So I checked him by saying loftily that I hoped he would make Falk pay for every penny of the damage. "That's it, go for him," called out Schomberg from the bar, flinging his pencil down and rubbing his hands. We ignored his noise, but Hermann's excitement suddenly went off the boil, as when you remove a saucepan from the fire. I urged on his consideration that he had done now with Falk and Falk's confounded tug. He, Hermann, would not perhaps turn up again in this part of the world for years to come, since he was going to sell the Diana at the end of this very trip. "Go home passenger in a mail-boat," he murmured mechanically. He was therefore safe from Falk's malice. All he had to do was to race off to his consignees and stop payment of the towage bill before Falk had the time to get in and lift the money. Nothing could have been less in the spirit of my advice than the thoughtful way in which he set about to make his parasol stay propped against the edge of the table. While I watched his concentrated efforts with astonishment, he threw at me one or two perplexed, half-shy glances. Then he sat down. "That's all very well," he said reflectively. It cannot be doubted that the man had been thrown off his balance by being hauled out of the harbor against his wish. His stolidity had been profoundly stirred, else he would never have made up his mind to ask me unexpectedly whether I had not remarked that Falk had been casting his eyes upon his niece. "No more than myself," I answered with literal truth. The girl was of the sort one necessarily casts eyes at in a sense. She made no noise, but she filled most satisfactorily a good bit of space. "But you, Captain, are not the same kind of man," observed Hermann. I was not, I am happy to say, in a position to deny this. "What about the lady?" I could not help asking. At this he gazed for a time into my face earnestly, and made as if to change the subject. I heard him beginning to mutter something unexpected about his children growing old enough to require schooling. He would have to leave them ashore with their grandmother when he took up that new command he expected to get in Germany. This constant harping on his domestic arrangements was funny. I suppose it must have been like the prospect of a complete alteration in his life, an epoch. He was going, too, to part with the Diana. He had served in her for years. He had inherited her, from an uncle, if I remember rightly, and the future loomed big before him, occupying his thought exclusively with all its aspects, as on the eve of a venturesome enterprise. He sat there frowning and biting his lip, and suddenly he began to fume and fret. I discovered, to my momentary amusement, that he seemed to imagine I could, should, or ought have caused Falk in some way to declare himself. Such a hope was incomprehensible, but funny. Then the contact with all this foolishness irritated me. I said crossly that I had seen no symptoms, but if there were any, since he, Hermann, was so sure, then it was still worse. What pleasure Falk found in humbugging people in just that way, I couldn't say. It was, however, my solemn duty to warn him. It had lately, I said, come to my knowledge that there was a man, not a very long time ago either, who had been taken in just like this. All this passed in undertones, and at this point Schomberg, exasperated at our secrecy, went out of the room, slamming the door with a crash that positively lifted us in our chairs. This, or else what I had said, huffed my Hermann. He supposed, with a contemptuous toss of his head towards the door, which trembled yet, that I had got hold of some of that man's silly tales. It looked indeed as though his mind had been thoroughly poisoned against Schomberg. His tales were, he repeated, seeking for the word, trash. They were trash, he reiterated, and moreover, I was young yet. This horrid aspersion, I regret I am no longer exposed to that sort of insult, made me huffy too. I felt ready in my own mind to back up every assertion of Schomberg's, and on any subject. In a moment, devil only knows why, Hermann and I were looking at each other most inimically. He caught up his hat without more ado, and I gave myself the pleasure of calling after him, "Take my advice and make Falk pay for breaking up your ship. You aren't likely to get anything else out of him." When I got on board my ship, the old mate, who was very full of the events of the morning, remarked, "I saw the tug coming back from the outer roads just before 2 p.m. He never by any chance used the words morning or afternoon, always p.m. or a.m., logbook style. "Smart work, that. Man's always in a state of hurry. He's a regular chucker-out, ain't he, sir? There's a few pubs I know of in the East End of London that would be all the better for one of his sort around the bar." He chuckled at his joke. "A regular chucker-out. Now he has fired out that Dutchman head over heels. I suppose our turn's coming tomorrow morning." We were all on deck at break of day. Even the sick, poor devils, had crawled out, ready to cast off in the twinkling of an eye. Nothing came. Falk did not come. At last, when I began to think that probably something had gone wrong in his engine room, we perceived the tug going by, full pelt, down the river, as if we hadn't existed. For a moment I entertained the wild notion that he was going to turn round in the next reach. Afterwards I watched his smoke appear above the plain, now here, now there, according to the windings of the river. It disappeared. Then, without a word, I went down to breakfast. I just simply went down to breakfast. Not one of us uttered a sound till the mate, after imbibing, by means of a suction out of a saucer, his second cup of tea, exclaimed, "Where the devil is the man gone to?" "Courting," I shouted with such a fiendish laugh that the old chap didn't venture to open his lips any more. I started to the office perfectly calm with excessive rage. Evidently they knew all about it already, and they treated me to a show of consternation. The manager, a soft-footed, obese man, breathing short, got up to meet me, while all round the room the young clerks, bending over their desks, cast glances in my direction. The fat man, without waiting for my complaint, wheezing heavily and in a tone as if he himself were incredulous, conveyed to me the news that Falk, Captain Falk, had absolutely declined to tow my ship, to have anything to do with my ship, this day or any other day. Never. I did my best to preserve a cool appearance, but all the same I must have shown how much taken aback I was. We were talking in the middle of the room. Suddenly, behind my back, some ass blew his nose with a great noise, and at the same time another quill driver got up and went out on the landing hastily. It occurred to me I was cutting a foolish figure there. I demanded angrily to see the principal in his private room. The skin of Mr. Zeger's head showed dead white between the iron-gray streaks of hair lying plastered crosswise from ear to ear over the top of his skull in the manner of a bandage. His narrow, sunken face was of a uniform and permanent terracotta color, like a piece of pottery. He was sickly, thin, and short, with wrists like a boy of 10. But from that debile body there issued a bullying voice, tremendously loud, harsh, and resonant, as if produced by some powerful mechanical contrivance in the nature of a foghorn. I do not know what he did with it in the private life of his home, but in the larger sphere of business it presented the advantage of overcoming arguments without the slightest mental effort by the mere volume of sound. We had had several passages of arms. It took me all I knew to guard the interest of my owners, whom, nota bene, I had never seen, while Ziegers, who had made their acquaintance some years before, during a business tour in Australia, pretended to the knowledge of their innermost minds, and in the character of our very good friends, threw them perpetually at my head. He looked at me with a jaundiced eye. There was no love lost between us, and declared at once that it was strange, very strange. His pronunciation of English was so extravagant that I can't even attempt to reproduce it. For instance, he said, "Very strange." Combined with the bellowing intonation, it made the language of one's childhood sound weirdly startling, and even if considered purely as a kind of unmeaning noise, it filled you with astonishment at first. "They had," he continued, "been acquainted with Captain Falk for many years, and never had any reason—" "That's why I come to you, of course," I interrupted. "I've the right to know the meaning of this infernal nonsense." In the half-light of the room, which was greenish because of the tree-tops screening the window, I saw him writhe his meager shoulders. It came into my head, as disconnected ideas will come at all sorts of times into one's head, that this most likely was the very room where, if the tale were true, Falk had been lectured by Mr. Ziegers the father. Mr. Ziegers the son's overwhelming voice, in brassy blasts, as though he had been trying to articulate words through a trumpet, was expressing his great regret at conduct characterized by a very marked want of discretion. As I lived, I was being lectured too. His deafening gibberish was difficult to follow, but it was my conduct, mine, that— Damn! I wasn't going to stand this. "What on earth are you driving at?" I asked in a passion. I put my hat on my head. He never offered a seat to anybody, and as he seemed for the moment struck dumb by my irreverence, I turned my back on him and marched out. His vocal arrangements blared after me a few threats of coming down on the ship for the demurrage of the lighters, and all the other expenses consequent upon the delays arising from my frivolity. Once outside in the sunshine, my head swam. It was no longer a question of mere delay. I perceived myself involved in hopeless and humiliating absurdities that were leading me to something very like a disaster. "Let us be calm," I muttered to myself, and ran into the shade of a leprous wall. From that short side street I could see the broad main thoroughfare, ruinous and gay, running away between stretches of decaying masonry, bamboo fences, ranges of arcades of brick and plaster, hovels of lath and mud, lofty temple gates of carved timber, huts of rotten mats, an immensely wide thoroughfare, loosely packed as far as the eye could reach with a barefooted and brown multitude paddling ankle-deep in the dust. For a moment I felt myself about to go out of my mind with worry and desperation. Some allowance must be made for the feelings of a young man new to responsibility. I thought of my crew. Half of them were ill, and I really began to think that some of them would end by dying on board if I couldn't get them out to sea soon. Obviously, I should have to take my ship down the river, either working under canvas or dredging with the anchor down. Operations which, in common with many modern sailors, I only knew theoretically, and I almost shrank from undertaking them short-handed and without local knowledge of the riverbed, which is so necessary for the confident handling of a ship. There were no pilots, no beacons, no buoys of any sort. But there was a very devil of a current for anybody to see, no end of shoal places, and at least two obviously awkward turns of the channel between me and the sea. But how dangerous these turns were, I could not tell. I didn't even know what my ship was capable of. I had never handled her in my life. A misunderstanding between a man and his ship, in a difficult river with no room to make it up, is bound to end in trouble for the man. On the other hand, it must be owned I had not much reason to count upon a general run of good luck. And suppose I had the misfortune to pile up high and dry on some beastly shoal. That would have been the final undoing of that voyage. It was plain that if Falk refused to tow me out, he would also refuse to pull me off. This meant what? A day lost at the very best, but more likely a whole fortnight of frizzling on some pestilential mud-flat, of desperate work, of discharging cargo. More than likely it meant borrowing money at an exorbitant rate of interest from the Zeegers gang, too, at that. They were a power in the port, and that elderly seaman of mine, Gambrill, had looked pretty ghastly when I went forward to dose him with quinine that morning. He would certainly die, not to speak of 2 or 3 others that seemed nearly as bad, and of the rest of them just ready to catch any tropical disease going. Horror, ruin, and everlasting remorse. And no help. None. I had fallen amongst a lot of unfriendly lunatics. At any rate, if I must take my ship down myself, it was my duty to produce, if possible, some local knowledge. But that was not easy. The only person I could think of for that service was a certain Johnson, formerly captain of a country ship, but now spliced to a country wife and gone utterly to the bad. I had only heard of him in the vaguest way, as living concealed in the thick of 200,000 natives, and only emerging into the light of the day for the purpose of hunting up some brandy. I had a notion that if I could lay my hands on him, I would sober him on board my ship and use him for a pilot. Better than nothing. Once a sailor, always a sailor, and he had known the river for years. But in our consulate, where I arrived dripping after a sharp walk, they could tell me nothing. The excellent young men on the staff, though willing to help me, belonged to a sphere of the white colony for which that sort of Johnson does not exist. Their suggestion was that I should hunt the man up myself with the help of the consulate's constable, an ex-sergeant major of a regiment of hussars. This man, whose usual duty apparently consisted in sitting behind a little table in an outer room of consular offices, when ordered to assist me in my search for Johnson, displayed lots of energy and a marvelous amount of local knowledge of a sort, but he did not conceal an immense and skeptical contempt for the whole business. We explored together on that afternoon an infinity of infamous grog shops, gambling dens, opium dens. We walked up narrow lanes where our gharry, a tiny box of a thing on wheels attached to a jibbing Burma pony, could by no means have passed. The constable seemed to be on terms of scornful intimacy with Maltese, with Eurasians, with Chinamen, with Klings, and with the sweepers belonging to a temple, with whom he talked at the gate. We interviewed also, through a grating in a mud wall closing a blind alley, an immensely corpulent Italian who, the ex-sergeant major remarked to me perfunctorily, had killed another man last year. Thereupon he addressed him as Antonio and Old Buck, though that bloated carcass, apparently more than half filling the sort of cell wherein it sat, recalled rather a fat pig in a sty. Familiar and never unbending, the sergeant absolutely chucked under the chin, a horribly wrinkled and shriveled old hag, propped on a stick, who had volunteered some sort of information, and with the same stolid face he kept up an animated conversation with the groups of swathed brown women who sat smoking cheroots on the doorsteps of a long range of clay hovels. We got out of the gharry and clambered into dwellings airy like packing crates, or descended into places sinister like cellars. We got in, we drove on, we got out again for the sole purpose, as it seemed, of looking behind a heap of rubble. The sun declined. My companion was curt and sardonic in his answers, but it appears we were just missing Johnson all along. At last our conveyance stopped once more with a jerk, and the driver, jumping down, opened the door. A black mud-hole blocked the lane. A mound of garbage, crowned with the dead body of a dog, arrested us not. An empty Australian beef tin bounded cheerily before the toe of my boot. Suddenly we clambered through a gap in a prickly fence. It was a very clean native compound, and the big native woman, with bare brown legs as thick as bedposts, pursuing on all fours a silver dollar that came rolling out from somewhere, was Mrs. Johnson herself. "Your man's at home," said the ex-sergeant, and stepped aside in complete and marked indifference to anything that might follow. Johnson, at home, stood with his back to a native house built on posts and with its walls made of mats. In his left hand he held a banana. Out of the right he dealt another dollar into space. The woman captured this one on the wing, and there and then plumped down on the ground to look at us with greater comfort. My man was sallow of face, grizzled, unshaven, muddy on elbows and back. Where the seams of his serge coat yawned, you could see his white nakedness. The vestiges of a paper collar encircled his neck. He looked at us with a grave, swaying surprise. "Where do you come from?" he asked. My heart sank. How could I have been stupid enough to waste energy and time for this? But having already gone so far, I approached a little nearer and declared the purpose of my visit. He would have to come at once with me, sleep on board my ship, and tomorrow, with the first of the ebb, he would give me his assistance in getting my ship down to the sea without steam, a 600-ton bark drawing 9 feet aft. I proposed to give him $18 for his local knowledge, and all the time I was speaking he kept on considering attentively the various aspects of the banana, holding first one side up to his eye, then the other. "You've forgotten to apologize," he said at last with extreme precision. "Not being a gentleman yourself, you don't know, apparently, when you intrude upon a gentleman. I am one. I wish you to understand that when I am in funds, I don't work. And now—" I would have pronounced him perfectly sober had he not paused in great concern to try and brush a hole off the knee of his trousers. "I have money and friends. Every gentleman has. Perhaps you would like to know my friend. His name is Falk. You could borrow some money. Try to remember. F-A-L-K, Falk." Abruptly his tone changed. "A noble heart," he said muzzily. "Has Falk been giving you some money?" I asked, appalled by the detailed finish of the dark plot. "Lent me, my good man, not given me," he corrected suavely. "Met me taking the air last evening, and being as usual anxious to oblige. Hadn't you better go to the devil out of my compound?" And upon this, without other warning, he let fly with the banana, which missed my head and took the constable just under the left eye. He rushed at the miserable Johnson, stammering with fury. They fell, but Why dwell on the wretchedness, the breathlessness, the degradation, the senselessness, the weariness, the ridicule and humiliation, and the perspiration of these moments? I dragged the ex-hussar off. He was like a wild beast. It seems he had been greatly annoyed at losing his free afternoon on my account. The garden of his bungalow required his personal attention, and at the slight blow of the banana, the brute in him had broken loose. We left Johnson on his back, still black in the face, but beginning to kick feebly. Meantime, the big woman had remained sitting on the ground, apparently paralyzed with extreme terror. For half an hour we jolted inside our rolling box, side by side, in profound silence. The ex-sergeant was busy staunching the blood of a long scratch on his cheek. "I hope you're satisfied," he said suddenly. "That's what comes of all that tomfool business. If you hadn't quarreled with that tugboat skipper over some girl or other, all this wouldn't have happened." "You heard that story?" I said. "Of course I heard, and I shouldn't wonder if the Consul General himself doesn't come to hear of it. How am I to go before him tomorrow with that thing on my cheek, I want to know? It's you who ought to have got this." After that, till the gharry stopped and he jumped out without leave-taking, he swore to himself steadily, horribly, muttering great purposeful trooper oaths, to which the worst a sailor can do is like the prattle of a child. For my part, I had just the strength to crawl into Schomberg's coffee-room, when I wrote at a little table a note to the mate instructing him to get everything ready for dropping down the river next day. I couldn't face my ship. Well, she had a clever sort of skipper, and no mistake, poor thing. What a horrid mess. I took my head between my hands. At times the obviousness of my innocence would reduce me to despair. What had I done? If I had done something to bring about the situation, I should at least have learned not to do it again. But I felt guiltless to the point of imbecility. The room was empty yet, only Schomberg prowled round me, goggle-eyed, and with a sort of awed, respectful curiosity. No doubt he had set the story going himself, but he was a good-hearted chap, and I am really persuaded he participated in all my trouble. He did what he could for me. He ranged aside the heavy match-stand, set a chair straight, pushed a spittoon slightly with his foot, as you show small attentions to a friend under a great sorrow, sighed, and at last, unable to hold his tongue, "Well, I warned you, Captain. That's what comes of running your head against Mr. Falk. Man'll stick at nothing." I sat without stirring, and after surveying me with a sort of commiseration in his eyes, he burst out in a hoarse whisper, "But for a fine lump of a girl, she's a fine lump of a girl." He made a loud, smacking noise with his thick lips. "The finest lump of a girl that I ever—" He was going on and on with great unction, but for some reason or other broke off. I fancied myself throwing something at his head. "I don't blame you, Captain. Hang me if I do," he said with a patronizing air. "Thank you," I said resignedly. It was no use fighting against this false fate. I don't know even if I was sure myself where the truth of the matter began. The conviction that it would end disastrously had been driven into me by all the successive shocks my sense of security had received. I began to ascribe an extraordinary potency to agents in themselves powerless. It was as if Schomberg's baseless gossip had the power to bring about the thing itself, or the abstract enmity of Falk could put my ship ashore. I have already explained how fatal this last would have been. For my further action, my youth, my inexperience, my very real concern for the health of my crew must be my excuse. The action itself, when it came, was purely impulsive. It was set in movement quite undiplomatically and simply by Falk's appearance in the doorway of the coffee room. The room was full by then and buzzing with voices. I had been looked at with curiosity by everyone, but how am I to describe the sensation produced by the appearance of Falk himself blocking the doorway? The tension of expectation could be measured by the profundity of the silence that fell upon the very click of the billiard balls. As to Schomberg, he looked extremely frightened. He hated mortally any sort of row. Fracas, he called it, in his establishment. Fracas was bad for business, he affirmed, but in truth this specimen of portly, middle-aged manhood was of a timid disposition. I don't know what, considering my presence in the place, they all hoped would come of it. A sort of stag fight, perhaps. Or they may have supposed Falk had come in only to annihilate me completely. As a matter of fact, Falk had come in because Hermann had asked him to inquire after the precious white cotton parasol, which, in the worry and excitement of the previous day, he had forgotten at the table where we had held our little discussion. It was this that gave me my opportunity. I don't think I would have gone to seek Falk out. No, I don't think so. There are limits. But there was an opportunity, and I seized it. I have already tried to explain why. Now I will merely state that, in my opinion, to get his sickly crew into the sea air and secure a quick despatch for his ship, a skipper would be justified in going to any length, short of absolute crime. He should put his pride in his pocket. He may accept confidences. He must explain his innocence as if it were a sin. He may take advantage of misconceptions, of desires and weaknesses. He ought to conceal his horror and other emotions. And if the fate of a human being, and that human being a magnificent young girl, is strangely involved, why, he should contemplate that fate, whatever it might seem to be, without turning a hair. And all these things I have done, the explaining, the listening, the pretending, even to the discretion. And nobody, not even Hermann's voice, I believe, need throw stones at me now. Schomberg, at all events, needn't, since from first to last, I am happy to say, there was not the slightest fracas.